My name is Brady. I'm a senior at Georgetown University, and I went on my circumnavigation in 2025. My research was on affordable housing. It was titled Public Good or Private Asset Defining Adequate and Affordable Housing in the Age of Neoliberal Urbanism. Put more simply, it was on how different cities around the world that have significant population increases or decreases deal with what affordability actually means within the context of local policy. I went to 6 countries on my trip. I started in Santiago, Chile, then across the pond to Vienna in Austria, then down to Cape Town, South Africa, back up to Singapore, then Seoul, South Korea, and finally ending in Tokyo, Japan. I learned about the fellowship when I was actually studying abroad already. I was studying in Sevilla, Spain for 4 months while I was completing Spanish requirements for university, and I came across the fellowship through the SFS, the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and was made aware kind of the stipulations of the project. I was able to read previous papers from past grantees and kind of get a better sense of what was happening. I put my all into the application after that. I tried to read over your previous grantees' work, try to understand the scope of the project, and then also what might define me as a unique candidate. So trying to create something that's both realistic but very interesting for people to read, and then also something that I thought was very important is having a very well thought out social impact factor within the research. So why is this research important? Why do I need to be traveling to all of these places? And what can be gained from me doing this specific research? For the application process, because I was abroad, a lot of it was being done pretty remotely. So I would go to info sessions that were done online. I would try to catch up on the resources that were provided. But throughout the application process, I was very flexible in terms of what I was kind of narrowing in on as a thesis. I initially started with the idea that, okay, I am generally interested in urbanization and the housing crisis. What ways can I implement that into research that also has to do with my degree, which is science, technology, and international affairs? So through that work, I submitted an initial application that was 5 pages on smart city technology. So I had done some kind of basic readings on that technology and realized that the smart city system is kind of propagated by just a few technology companies. And in fact, I kind of wanted to pivot from just focusing on smart cities and focusing more on like the social impact of urbanization. So when I revised to my 10-page paper, I shifted that focus a lot more towards affordability than I really did the technology aspect of things and allowed myself to kind of come to a new thesis without trying to force it. So keeping an open mind when it came to the initial drafting stages, then being as thorough as possible as I could be in those 2 initial drafting stages. So thinking very specifically about, okay, where am I going to be staying within these cities? What areas are safe? What areas give me good access to transportation? Who do I want to reach out to? How am I going to even order the countries that I'm going to make it most efficient? So there was a lot of really small technical details in there to make sure that I'm making good use of the budget. I'm making good use of my own time. I'm not going to wear myself down too quickly. I'm going to have the opportunities to visit places that, I've only dreamed of visiting up until this point. So trying to keep all of those factors in mind when planning it, but then also just throughout those writing processes, becoming very familiar with the topic and with the places that I want to go to. Um, I can really speak to their importance within the project. And it's interestingly enough, I did end up pivoting away from some of my initial selections of places as well, whether that is because of national security issues with those specific countries, with the State Department recommendations being to stay away from those places, or just realizing that I wanted more in-depth time in certain locations, is what caused me to settle on those final 6. And then the interview process, I really had positive interaction at Circumnavigators. I think the interview process was the first that I really got face to face with people, because a lot of the initial stages were done through Georgetown in collaboration with the grant organization. So I had received just kind of base level feedback, and then the interview process was where I really got to share kind of my individual passion for the project. I really got to engage in like conversation with the alumni of the program with Mr. Whalen, and really had the opportunity then to talk about my limited experience traveling abroad, but what I had learned from it, how I would want to adapt to certain scenarios. And I think there is really when the passion kind of shone through. Obviously, with the application, you have to be somewhat limited in how you're describing why you're doing this. I had a section of the application that was just an essay basically about why this topic mattered to me, but it mattered a lot more that I was able to articulate it in person. And, after that process was over and I received the call that night, I remember celebrating so loudly that my host mom in Spain yelled at me. Um, but I was over the moon and immediately started not only planning out the trip in more detail, but thinking critically about what my thesis will be when realized, what ways might it change, and then starting to do cultural research on these places as well. And that stemmed from, browsing the State Department websites to working on my social media algorithms to get the best kind of like travel tips and guides to these specific cities. So I would say like then the next 3 months were me essentially researching who I wanted to talk to. And I think I sent out maybe 200 emails in the span of 3 months. The project was something I thought about daily, even in the semester before going on it. So I would have a lot of frequent conversation and collaboration with Mr. Whalen, with the circumnavigators, be sending emails constantly. Um, you know, this place might not work for me anymore, or would I be able to do this? What's my timeline on this? So it really became like a living project for me. It didn't end with the interview. It pretty much continued up until I was getting on the plane. But I was prepping all of that. I even talked to one of my interviewees before I had left on the trip. He had actually offered to like give me kind of a rundown on Santiago. So I was, trying to immerse myself as much as possible before going, practice my Spanish, which was pretty rusty until that point. But yeah, I remember those months very fondly. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of work that I was really interested in doing. I chose my topic really because it's been a mainstay of my family throughout my entire life to think about housing as more than just shelter, but as a social good and a resource. My grandfather has been in very local politics since I was essentially born. He was a local mayor, not of a large city, but kind of a smaller village within the Cincinnati metropolitan area, and then moved on to be a township administrator. So he was working on everything from zoning to fixing traffic lights to working with the fire department. But a large part of that too was like, how do you go into these areas of different neighborhoods and like make sure that they're supported, make sure that people have good living conditions, the roads are safe, things of that nature. So really getting kind of a holistic view of the local government level. And then with my mom, she's a local realtor, so she does a lot of work with just like small to mid-sized houses. She's not selling like these mega mansions, but she's working with, just the everyday family in Cincinnati, trying to figure out, okay, this is the most significant financial decision of your life and also an essential part of your base level needs as a human being. You need a place to live. You need something that's accessible to you, that's clean. So really getting to hear that perspective from her as well, how much this weighs on people, what a monumental decision this is, and how taxing it can be. Both of those were just very present in my mind as I went into the research process. And I've always had an interest in urbanism in architecture. Before coming to Georgetown, I had initially wanted to be an architect, but definitely swung more in the direction of political thinking, of international development, and then science and technology too. So a big part of why I settled on this project is because these cities that I discussed are really creating a lot of innovative ways to address the affordability crisis around the world. And in DC, where I'm going to school now, I mean, you're confronted with it constantly. One of the really striking moments that drove me to this topic was my first year at Georgetown when I was volunteering for our home organization, which is a homeless outreach program for the unhoused population in Washington, D.C. I was handing out food, water, and gloves to people that were on a bridge near campus and saw maybe 14 or 15 tents that were covered with one giant American flag. And this just really stark contrast and irony stood out to me as something just so shameful on the American system that we let this many people fall through the cracks, um, go without adequate housing. So really that kind of drove me to think, how can we collect stories from around the world, collect strategies from around the world that might improve that kind of situation that you tend to see day to day in America and come up with something that's a little bit healthier than what seems to be the kind of go-to option right now, which is just out of sight, out of mind. That's never really made humanitarian sense to me, and it just doesn't seem empathetic. So I was driven to try to find a better solution in that way. So really, when I began to research the topic, first I kind of understood from a health perspective how important this is for people. When you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have food, you have water, and you have shelter. Like this very kind of fundamental concept to human well-being, um, having safe living and adequate living, I think is part of the human condition. It's not really part of an American condition or a local DC condition. Um, and when I did more research into how these issues manifest in the United States, I realized how much of this, um, or rather, how much the US tends to borrow creative solutions from places abroad, trying to come up with mixed zone development ideas that are popular in places like Vienna, or tries to address urbanism by looking at places like Seoul or Tokyo, which are incredibly urbanized. So trying to understand that despite these issues being very local level, um, the international sphere gives you a lot of different examples for solutions that have worked for certain areas. And in an age in America when it seems like nothing is working as well as we want it to be, I wanted to first look at examples abroad of places where they have come to a better solution and then what I can learn from that. But then also expand that out to try to learn, given the context of other places that have similar struggles to the US, how are they adapting in a way that might be outside of the kind of immediate policy that the US tends to act on. Santiago really started as a way of understanding kind of a few fronts. One, it was how housing is able to be constructed so quickly for people in need of it due to natural disasters. I thought that was a very interesting kind of smaller point to look at, and that manifested in my research by talking with people who house populations outside of the city after they've been displaced by any kind of floods, earthquakes, etc. But then also looking at the migrant population in the city. So a lot of migrants are coming into Santiago very constantly. How are we treating migrants in that area? And how does that play into the housing systems versus the people that are living there for extended periods of time? And then finally, I chose the city because it has kind of the classic example of rural pushes, but essentially because people are often forced out of the city center due to rising expenses. I thought it was an apt comparison to places like New York or LA, where people are being forced out of the city centers because of rising prices. So I wanted to look at that within the context of a South American country and how they might be dealing with that issue, kind of in response to people not being able to find something that's well located for them. They're being instead forced out into these really unsafe areas outside of the city. Santiago brought just a number of different insights. One was the ways in which they addressed community building not solely as a responsibility of the government, but a responsibility to love one's community, to really appreciate where you are within the city. There's a program called Quiero mi barrio, which is like Love My Neighborhood, um, which implemented a lot of interesting structural changes to city zoning where you would have kind of these local councils of people that would be involved in cleaning their neighborhoods, in renovating them. It would give a lot of money to fix certain aspects of kind of wear and tear within the city. But then also learning about these like really intelligently designed building processes that they're using to house people in a way that is sustainable over a long period of time versus like forcing people into temporary shelters. A lot of their effort is focused on actually creating a sustainable location for people and then being able to support them within that location instead of trying to reassign to somewhere else. And really, Santiago is where I shifted my focus not only from what is, affordable housing, but to what is adequate housing. Like there was a lot of conversation in Santiago about essentially what are overcrowded houses. So people who are forced into housing with extended family, with family friends, and how that can lead to a lot of negative health effects and a lot of cases of abuse. So how the city is responding to overcrowding and how they might better facilitate houses that actually fit the people that are going to be living in them. So that also really changed my mindset in the sense that I no longer want to talk about what's just affordable for people, but once they're able to afford a place, is it actually living up to basic human decency standards? I met a bunch of amazing people in Santiago, but one of the researchers that I got closest to was a man named Javier. He had actually reached out to me before I had arrived in Santiago and asked if I needed any tips or tricks in navigating the city. He was kind enough to kind of give me an introductory glance into how the city functions for my research. And he works at an organization called Techo Chile and collaborates with another organization called Fundación Vivienda. And what this organization does is it creates disaster response plans and housing for people within Chile. So I was able to go and see his role as an architect within their facility, but then also, what these houses look like, how the architects consider human decency standards when they're creating these places, and what their usefulness is within the city. So just a really, really in-depth analysis of disaster response and housing. And then also like I got to see the factory. I got to see the reality of his work. We had initially planned on meeting three times, and he had to cancel on his last meeting with me because there was a tornado in northern Chile, and he had to work on designing houses to replace those that were lost. So really interesting in that sense that I got to see on the ground how things work there. Um, Another really, really impactful moment for me was an interview with Professor Bustos at the architecture school in the University of Chile, University of Santiago as well. She invited me to a class for architecture students on affordable and adequate housing. So I got to sit in, listen to the best of my ability in Spanish on how, architects are learning to build spaces that are both affordable and adequate for people. And that was just really incredible to be able to sit front row and even answer questions to the best, again, of my ability in Spanish. But yeah, I was able to kind of see people my age that are actively involved in this. My largest takeaway from my time in Santiago was, again, that idea of adequacy. They think very critically, not only of what is affordable within the city, but how are we preventing crime? How are we preventing abuse? How are we preventing um, like mental decline and mental illness in the places that people are living? How does it connect to their family? How does it connect to their sense of community? How does it connect to the local art scene? How are they getting transportation to their jobs? Um, Really, that wider perspective on what housing is really shifted it for me because the conversation in America is often, I need something affordable, but I think there's really two steps to creating a fair housing system, and it's something that's affordable, but then something that also fits people. So then seeing that, and then seeing not only how the government is invested in these programs in so many ways, but then also NGOs, universities, this really strong, I would say, civil society is all working together on this, which I really admired. Vienna, when you talk about housing, is a pretty obvious choice because of how much it's propagated as this kind of pinnacle example of what affordable housing is. So I really chose Vienna because of its international renown when it comes to housing. And looking more into that, I wanted to understand what does it look like for a housing system to be decommodified in a way where housing is not as much a financial asset as it is a good that is provided to the public. I think what was really, really insightful about my time in Vienna was how realistic it can be for housing to lose its status as a financial asset and be more of a public good. I think the biggest takeaway was that it doesn't require an entirely socialist system to have housing as a public good. It just is a way of redirecting money away from, spending most of your income on rent to spending it on things that sustain you over time. So whether that be food, transportation, et cetera, it really showed me that housing does not need to be consistently classified financially. And instead, there are several ways in which consistent innovation can be inspired when it comes to public housing. And it can become so ingrained in people's lives and so ingrained in policy that no matter what the administration is in power, people don't see a need for change. They feel satisfied with where the housing is. One of my favorite conversations was with someone that works in kind of the housing policy space. Her name is Emila Srbegovic. She immigrated to Vienna and actually gave me a tour of one of the neighborhoods in Vienna and kind of pointed out how these places are constructed, what makes them unique, and then also her own experience going into the city and trying to enter into that whole process. So really getting like a hands-on experience of understanding, okay, this is public housing, this is private housing. Why does why is this kindergarten positioned here to really maximize community in this way? Why is this green space really important when the neighborhood is being considered when it's being constructed? And then also kind of how many different government and private actors are involved in the housing space. So whether that be a private actor or a public actor, they're both in constant collaboration trying to figure out what's the best way to support an affordable community. Vienna really showed me the power of decommodified housing. So whether or not that's the only option for people, I think it showed me how viable it is as an option for people to not think of housing as something that they need to own and collect revenue on, but rather something that can be provided, but is still like communally maintained and then allows them to direct a lot of their energy, time, and money to other things. So what ways can the government really provide that support and work with nonprofit and private actors to make that a reality for people in a way that is not a detriment to society? It really tends to benefit all of those involved. With Cape Town, I really wanted to look at the history of segregation within the city. I think it's especially relevant when you talk about the contrast to American segregation and how that's affected a lot of zoning, a lot of districting, and what effects it might have long term after that segregation has ended. So I wanted to understand kind of the comparison between redlining in the United States and how it might have manifested in another really notable example of a segregated society that has moved past legal segregation and in many ways kind of exists in a de facto form of segregation. I spent a lot of time learning about government initiatives and NGOs within that ecosystem that were attempting to fix what is a really dire housing crisis in the city. So you have an enclave in the central business district area that is relatively well off, is mostly white, and then in the surrounding area outside of the city, you have townships where people are living in pieces of wood and tin and metal that are all kind of stitched together, constantly being flooded. So trying to understand how that discrepancy arose, how current efforts are attempting to fix it, and then where those efforts might be going wrong, um, and what it takes in terms of government and private collaboration, which covered a lot. It covered um, movements within the city for people to occupy vacant spaces. It covered like academic analyses of income in certain areas and the financial burden of living outside of the city versus inside the city. Really just seeing those discrepancies in person, having conversation with people who are heavily involved in NGOs and are in the constant process of fighting with the government for more funding, for land to be open to people who need affordable housing as opposed to private developers. So one of the really interesting conversations I had was with Brett Herod, who is a member of parliament in the government who is an advocate for affordable housing, but has had a lot of clashes with some of like the notable activists within the city. Um, so I had a conversation with him about his role in government. I actually got to visit the Parliament building. I got to ask him kind of some hard-hitting questions about, you know, why are these things being pushed back? Why has housing become such a politicized issue, such a racialized issue? Um, and get his perspective on that as a member of the Good Party, which is also not currently in power. So what is being done by people who are in kind of minority when it comes to creating affordable housing, and hearing some really hard realities as well from him about how a lot of politicians are mostly responsive to wealthy taxpayers, since a large part of the population in Cape Town can't and is not required to pay taxes because they're living in poverty. Um, so being able to get that governmental perspective was really valuable for me. But another person that I met while I was in Cape Town was Dr. Mercy Brown Luthongo, who is at the University of Cape Town. And really what was so special about my conversation with her is that she is not only a senior researcher for the African Center for Cities, so she's constantly working on positive urbanization, but she'd also lived in some of the communities outside of the city that were um, in serious uh, poverty and witnessed floods, lots of gun violence, etc. So I got to get a firsthand perspective on what it's like to live in one of these places, what is being done on a local level by people that are involved in these NGOs and nonprofits, but then also, how angry some people are about seeing these kind of half-baked solutions being implemented, and knowing because of experience or from the experience of close friends that these are not adequate measures to solve the issue. I was able to have a very nice, long conversation with her. We hugged after the interview. It was just very, very nice, very personal. Um, and I'm very thankful that she was willing to open up on a lot of that. I think in the same way that you have to face some harsh realities in America, I had to face the harsh reality while in Cape Town that a lot of the issues from the apartheid era are not close to being solved, especially when it comes to housing. These segregated districting laws and decades and decades of pushing people to peripheries, pushing people out of certain occupations, leads to really long-standing consequences that are still very, very relevant to the modern day. Um, and drawing that important parallel to the US, where we still see a lot of the same effects of redlining. Um, and being able to then understand how do we go about fixing that in a way that's realistic? And how do you have those kind of difficult conversations out in the open, which is what I was doing while being in the city. And I was able to understand, this is probably a more extreme example than a lot of places in the United States, but it's still eerily similar and very relevant, especially when it comes to the privatization of housing and how that can really force people out because of wealth disparities within certain populations. So I picked Singapore for a similar reason to Vienna in the sense that it has this very international reputation for being a place where the issue of housing has been addressed in a more full capacity. So really, it came down to a very stark contrast to Vienna, whereas in Vienna things are very decommodified. Singapore has essentially commodified public housing, but 90% of the population owns their homes within the city. So I wanted to understand, how that comes to be, um, why it's so important for these government programs to support people, and how can they do something that seems so impossible for a lot of American cities. That was really the impetus for it. I was able to kind of understand once I got to Singapore how unique and complex the system of HDB is, the Housing Development Board. So it's this government body that owns essentially a large majority of the housing in Singapore and creates a very specific regulated system that considers everything from family size to marriage status to race and ethnicity, trying to create kind of the perfect environment for people where they are not paying an exorbitant amount for their housing because it comes out of their essentially social security funds, their CPFs. Um, but then also how different cultural norms that are driven by the government play into their housing. So you have to be married to enter into the housing system. There are incentives to live near family, to live near work, and then incentives to meet racial quotas within certain housing blocks because Singapore's government desires an integrated racial experience versus one that's a little bit more stratified. Um, so being able to see how involved the government can be in a system while still allowing people to make a profit off of it by selling their leases for more money later in life, I thought was just fascinating. One of my favorite meetings from Singapore was with Professor um, Tessiera, who works at Singapore University of Social Sciences. I met him in like a small bustling cafe and sat down while he waited for his mom to be out of church, um, and chatted about um, how the Housing Development Board functions around property owning, different labor incentives for it, uh, the dangers of leaning too heavily on Social Security, um, and then how the government manages such a complex system, how it has this very consistent incentive to keep housing prices on the same level because housing essentially serves as the goose egg for a lot of people's retirement. So how interconnected the housing system is with other aspects of the government, and how much of a focus is on that. But then also some of the unique cultural experiences of that housing system, like how when you're wanting to get married to someone, you have to almost pre-propose by asking for a flat because that's how you enter the housing system. Just really unique things like that, that gave me a deeper insight into how that housing system might affect people's daily lives. One of my biggest takeaways from Singapore was how you can almost have your cake and eat it too with government intervention and privatization, if that is the desired system. So the ways in which the government did intervene in Singapore in order to create a system that's self-sustaining and actually beneficial to the population by kind of helping design and implement housing policy, but then allowing people to make profit off of it or implementing social programs within the housing infrastructure to bring people closer to family, closer to their community, closer to their sources of income. It was just incredibly thorough. And what I really appreciated about it was constantly evolving even while I was there. Every 5 and 10 years, they have new city planning proposals and city planning kind of future documents that think ahead about the most important issues on the horizon, whether that be environmental issues, whether that be affordability issues. Um, it was very well thought out. And I think that is something that tends to not be the case in a place like Washington, D.C., for example, where things are um, kind of happening as we go. And these long-term plans tend to be overturned by different political opinions. Seoul was a target for me on the trip because of its status as sort of an urban megacity. So it's a place where the kind of traditional definition of a city is hard to apply in a certain way because of how large it is. It encompasses so much of the population of South Korea in such a large area that it has to be considered almost in a different category. And I wanted to understand if urbanization is the path that we're on and continue to be on, not only in the US, but around the world, then if this is kind of the end game, how can we understand, solving the housing crisis from that highly urbanized perspective? Seoul really taught me how unique some of the housing policy is within the city. They have this system called Geants. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but essentially it was like paying all of your rent up front um, as a massive deposit. So then people that are owning these houses can go and spend it on development for other places. It's just a very unique system that I don't think has a direct parallel really anywhere else in the world. But we talked about a lot of the failings of that system and then a lot of how highly commodified housing has become in Seoul. So, like I talked about with Santiago, people are being pushed out of the city. Um, People are facing increasing prices, and then also facing just this very commercialized idea of housing within the city, where it's almost popular amongst young people to look into buying property and owning property because of the financial gains that that can create and how that might play into like commercialization within the city and then the lack of space that tends to be a pretty prevalent talking point because more and more people continue to come in. It requires a lot of creative ideas around zoning, around infrastructure, and how to fit everything in an adequate way. While I was in Seoul, I was able to meet with a number of different people. One of the most notable to me was with Dr. Kang, who works at Yonsei University, and he and I were able to go through not only the kind of normal systems of affordable housing within Korea, but then also, you know, critical thoughts about adequacy within the city of Seoul. So these micro apartments, how they might be affecting people's mental health, but serve as the only real affordable option for a lot of young people. How the cultural differences between Seoul and America play out in how long you live with parents. How you define your own economic and actual physical independence. It differs a lot, and I think we kind of circle back to this like core argument about this like speculative culture um, and the potential for unstable employment causing a very um, volatile housing system that is very subject to change depending on the economy and the government administration. So I learned a lot about the history of mayors within Seoul and how their work either directly benefited or detracted from the housing supply and housing experience. I think my largest takeaways from Seoul tended to be about the over commercialization of housing and how prevalent that can be even in these really large urban areas where the constant desire to upgrade, the constant desire to create, to construct at an affordable level tends to detract from lived realities of adequacy. So it often requires you to, I guess, think more about money than you do of the human experience and how that can cause mental health effects, how that can cause physical effects, and how dangerous it can be for some people. Tokyo was on my list for a similar reason to Seoul, in that it's an urban megacenter. It's a place where urbanization is so strong that it's one of the largest cities in the world. Um, but I also wanted to look at Tokyo because it's interesting in the sense that they have an abundance of housing supply. Housing supply is less of an issue there than I would say it is in a lot of other places, and adequacy is more framed around the ability of people to find affordable housing, working blue collar jobs, or allowing older residents to live near jobs or daily services. Um, and how the conversation really became about supporting those members of the community and then using certain policy levers to make that happen. And like Sol kind of talking about, the prevalence of micro units and how that might be destructive for people. One of my largest kind of learning experiences while in Tokyo was about kind of Japan and Tokyo's specifically blend of sort of developmental statism, where the government is very involved um, in the housing operation, uh, kind of mixing with the neoliberal market incentives that are producing kind of the slow moving displacement from the city, some areas of cultural erosion, which really prevent kind of like certain communities from flourishing. You see a lot of like cultural landmarks within the city of Tokyo being erased over time because of neoliberalism, um, creating incentives for industrialization, for construction that isn't tailored to the people as much as it is developers. One of my most impactful interviews while in Tokyo was with Professor Sho, who is at the University of Tokyo. And he was able to tell me kind of about, as I said before, Japan's kind of unique situation being a society that's governed um, by strong local governance, but then also neoliberal incentives. He was also able to tell me more about some of the deregulation that's happening in the city, as well as some of the mega projects that are weakening some of the cultural commons within the city. And one of my favorite parts about talking with him was the time that we spent outside of the interview, because he invited me to a workshop that he was doing between students at the University of Tokyo and um, at a university in Taiwan. So I was able to collaborate with both of those groups of students and actually kind of serve as like a middleman, being the only person in the room that had English as their first language when everything was being taught in English. So I was able to work with students my age and with these really knowledgeable academics from both countries. So yeah, I was able to really glean a lot from that. We went around the city looking at specific neighborhoods and how they're being developed, and I got to have a really hands-on experience. I think my biggest takeaway was again kind of how a blend of strong local governance and neoliberalism can come into conflict with one another when it comes to delegating housing within the local government context. So, despite the government being very involved in the process of housing, there tends to be a lot more incentive to favor developers and kind of the preference for new construction over utilizing what already exists, which is good for a lot of developers, but not for a lot of community members, as well as preserving kind of cultural heritage in certain areas. So I would say, yeah, in that sense, it's a lot more to do with kind of that conflict. I think one of the things that's not super specific, but I'm really proud of is the time I spent taking photos. I'm a photographer at Georgetown. I do mostly like studio and fashion photography, but I was very intentional about taking photos of everything while I was in these places, not only for the purpose of my research, taking photos of public housing structures, government buildings, et cetera, but also just of things that I really enjoyed. And I was able to create a photo magazine, a photo journal, after my trip, which I have right here, um, which just has a collection of some of the art and photos that I took. You can see like on this page, it's a lot more like scenery, and then on the other, it's actually from my neighborhood tour in Vienna. So like really being able to be intentional about what I'm looking at when I went to these places, whether that be in Singapore when I'd go far outside of the city to try to find a certain public housing structure, public housing block, or in Vienna when I would go and try to like find these really well-known and older public housing buildings that have been in the city for almost 100 years. So really that was fulfilling for me in the sense that I got to create an artistic project out of something that was also so research heavy. Really what I would say was also extremely valuable for me was being able to connect with people outside of my research, whether that be having lunch with some of the people I interviewed, or even just meeting people on the street, meeting people in shops, in my hotels. I was very intentional about striking up a conversation with anyone, and I made a lot of like long-lasting friendships. I would say I'm still in contact with a lot of those people. I saw a lot of great music when I was taking time off, which is another really big passion of mine. So being able to explore new types of music and meet people through those avenues as well was extremely fulfilling for me, because I created this very healthy balance of really intense and focused research, but then also like experiencing these places, experiencing the culture that kind of defines them. And I am incredibly thankful that I've had like multiple hour, 2 hour long conversations with people I never would have met otherwise, and hearing their stories and hearing how many similarities we have with each other. I have to say, when it comes to unexpected challenges, there were fewer than I was expecting. Um, I kind of was thinking that something would go majorly wrong at some point, because I wanted to be prepared. But the closest thing that I had to like a major issue was um, my commute from Cape Town to Singapore was going through Doha, and that was at a moment when the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine was really heating up, and there was closure of airspaces around Qatar. So I had to deal with kind of the idea of needing to reroute, not having a lot of great alternatives, trying to get through that area, and I inevitably was able to keep my flight because they had reopened the airspaces, but there was definitely still a lot of anxiety for me going through that. The only other thing was like losing my suitcase for a few days, which was thankfully returned, although it had completely opened up and exploded. Luckily, I packed everything in packing cubes, so I was able to get it all back. Um, so that was not fun, but I never felt very lonely on the trip. I was meeting so many people. I was able to meet up with people that I knew already in a lot of these places um, from university, which is really nice. Um, so yeah, I think when it comes down to it, I didn't get sick. I will say there was one fun moment where when I was staying in Singapore, I stayed in a pod hostel where you're in like a very kind of tight tube. And one morning I sat up way too quickly and slammed my head on the top of the pod hostel and thought that I was definitely concussed. Um, it was that bad. Um, but I was able to go and see a doctor in Chinatown in Singapore for $20. And it was in and out, full concussion test with a medical doctor. Um, and it was one of the best healthcare experiences I've ever had in my life. And I was completely fine. Um, so yeah, I would say nothing was dire. One of my favorite memories came very early when I was meeting with Javier, who I mentioned earlier. Before we had an interview or anything, we just sat in a cafe um, and talked for like 2 hours, just about all the things that we had in common. And that was the first time I realized, like, no matter where I am in the world, there is someone that is extremely similar to me that I can bond with. And that just was a very like kind of small world moment. And he took me on a tour afterwards to see a lot of art in the city and a lot of murals. And it was really spectacular, really special. Um, Another moment when I was in Vienna, I took a day trip to Hallstatt, which is like 3 or 4 hours by train outside of the city. Actually extended my stay in Vienna so I could take that trip, essentially take a little break. Ended up swimming in the Alps in freezing cold water. Um, but it was just so like healing in such a way. And the views were spectacular. When it came to Cape Town, I had a really funny moment where I was having um, a drink with one of my friends from Georgetown who happened to be in the city. And I ran into someone from my high school just completely randomly, who I hadn't seen in 4 years. And I'm from a like, a random high school in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I ran into him, which was just like another increasingly small world moment. Then I had a lot of really great memories from um, Singapore. I met a local artist, an indie rock artist, and we bonded. I was able to like, she's also a fashion designer. She let me like try on the clothes that she had designed. I was able to explore a bunch of neighborhoods, like getting her perspective on everything. Um, that was really special for me. And then so were a lot of those interviews that I had, like with Professor Teracera, because we were just also having conversation in a cafe. I can like picture those cafes. Um, and then in Seoul, as well, I met up with a friend from Georgetown who is from Seoul and lives in the city, and I got to see her perspective, not only for my research in terms of what it's like to live in the city, but then also like what it's like to contrast it with somewhere like the US and really have that like mental comparison at the ready. A lot of great music experiences in Seoul as well. I saw a lot of Korean indie rock, just Korean hip hop, like just really, really great music in the city. And then in Tokyo, I think one of my favorite days was the workshop that I did with Professor Show, going around the city, seeing these places, hearing the professor's analysis of them, but then also like my peers from around the world, having lunch with all of them, just like such different experiences from mine, but so many commonalities. It was just really special for me. I remember my culture shock was pretty extreme because I went from Tokyo to getting back and going to Lollapalooza um, to see music that I liked, and it was just a lot of American culture thrown at me really quickly. But even now, I feel so much nostalgia for this trip and like the amount of freedom that I had to experience cultures other than my own. Now I feel almost limited in a lot of ways being in the US, but so thankful to have my perspective broadened that much. I think I'm definitely having trouble now reconciling with the fact that, next year I'm working um just like a traditional job of sorts, and I'm not going to be traveling doing my own research. So it's definitely like a hard reality, but that just goes to show how special the experience was. I actually decided not to turn my research into an honors thesis because I'd have to alter it in a pretty significant way to kind of force it to align with the requirements of my major. So really, the study for me is something that serves more of the it's more of an independent project for me that not represented by the paper that I wrote, but the presentation, the collections of photos from my magazine, the collection of blogs that I wrote um, that I hope to use at some point down the line when I hope to work in public policy around housing. So yeah, that's kind of where it is for me right now. It still aligns in so many different capacities with my Georgetown education, um, and has really informed so much now when I'm taking classes on like sustainable architecture and like sustainable development. Like, what does that look like um, when it comes to housing? I feel like I definitely have a step up in that way, but I've appreciated that the project is independent and I can truly customize it in a way that felt right for me. I think down the line, when I want to work in urban planning, the trip definitely taught me that at some point in my life, I want to come back to that. For one, the trip taught me that I wanted to live in New York. I wanted to live in a big city, like the ones that I experienced, which was a really huge shift for me. It also is like the only thing I talked about in pretty much every interview that I had, because there's so much that I learned from it, not only from the policy perspective, but organizational skills, interpersonal skills, research skills, data analysis skills. Really, like no matter what job you're doing, nothing could prepare you better for being an exceptional candidate than a project like this. So yeah, I'm incredibly grateful in that sense as well. I know the one life lesson that comes to mind almost immediately is just like how important it is to be organized when you are juggling so many different things at once. Throughout the trip, oftentimes I would be reflecting on an interview I've had. I'd be researching and preparing for another one coming up, and then I'd also be emailing someone from a later section of the trip, trying to set up times and everything like that, as well as catching flights at the right time, staying in the right locations, and getting to those locations. Um, I never felt extremely stressed because I had things organized in a way that was really effective for me, and that is a skill that I will forever carry with me. I think just the life lesson that I think resonates the most with me, that's a little bit less kind of straightforward, is um, just how easy it can be to connect with people when you open yourself up to it. Nowhere that I went did I not find some kind of connection with the people I was talking to. And it can be something as arbitrary as liking a similar kind of music, or it can be something as deep as like whole life philosophies or um, desires for the future, passions around activism, things of that nature. I truly I came into Georgetown writing an essay about how I wanted to be a global citizen, and I think this trip taught me that it's very possible to be a person of the world who is deeply passionate about connecting abroad and connecting to communities that might not seem close in a lot of ways. Interestingly enough, I think one of the life lessons I learned about myself was my ability to function independently. I think for a lot of my time at Georgetown, like I've built such a community around me that I haven't spent a lot of time alone for such a like significant amount of my summer. And I was able to really find the confidence within myself to be comfortable in that solitude and then be able to realize my vision for the project without too much assistance, really kind of shape it with my own vision. And I think it gave me a lot of confidence in my ability to do research, but also to have conversations with people, to traverse language barriers, to navigate difficult travel. So all of those different things at once, it gave me a really big confidence boost. For the photo magazine, I think I learned very quickly how much I enjoy blending um, sort of social activism and social critique with art, especially in the art that I produce. Not only through photography, which I'm trying to implement more into the photography that I'm doing, but then also through music. I'm aspiring to like write songs and create songs, and um, I've really been inspired to implement this kind of critical thinking about topics that I care about within art, and reflect on it. When it comes to the more hard research, I think I really learned how important, one, actually, I'll start by saying how difficult it is to take something as complex as adequate housing and narrow it down to something that is that fit. I was just saying how difficult it can be to write something concise about such a difficult issue because of how many rabbit holes you can go down, how important it is when you're doing research on a very human topic that is about human rights to be thorough about what adequacy means, for example, and to really do these topics justice. Because you could have a series of three books on each one of these individual cities, and to try to consolidate all of that in a way that's easily communicated was very difficult. I think my first piece of advice would always just be like fall in love with your topic and with the idea of travel. I think I really did from the start. Not only was I extremely passionate about housing and finding a solution through my research, but also just being able to experience the world and really showing that passion, both in the application and in the interview, not being afraid to just be authentic, and show that love for where you are and where you want to be. This is a pretty specific piece of advice, but I would say when you're reaching out to people over email, I think one, it's helpful to always have it bilingual. So send one in English and then one in whatever language is primarily spoken in that country. Even if the person most likely knows English, I think it's a really nice courtesy, and I think a lot of people appreciated it. And then two, I think like the sweet spot to reach out to people is anywhere from a month to 2 weeks before you would meet up with them. I sent a lot of emails out months and months in advance, and oftentimes those would go unnoticed. So I think that's a little bit more technical. But as I was saying before, like just have a good system in place for keeping dates straight and use your blog as well for that to be able to keep all the information kind of readily available for you to reflect on. I think is really helpful. I'd say my biggest piece of advice for people writing their paper after the trip is to really think in depth about each individual place that you went to first and then create your comparison later, because I think it was really helpful for me to almost write individual papers for each location to really give it the thought that it deserved and to make sure that no place was being considered more heavily than the other, and then bring it all together in different sections of the paper to really like create that cohesion. As cliche as it sounds, I would characterize the foundation's experience as life-changing. Um, it's very eye-opening in the sense that you are exposed to so much that completely exceeds the bounds of your project, in a way that makes you think very differently about how the world works and where you want to be within it. I would say like one of the largest benefits for me was the personal growth that I experienced, not only in learning my capability to produce such a thorough project, but also just gaining the confidence to know that I'm capable of such a thing. And then to have that experience to look back on when you face moments of crisis. I think even now, I look back on the project as a source of pride. And I think it's very valuable in that way. But then, yeah, like I said before, it's also um, a really great way to remember how possible it is to connect with people despite differences.